For those who are aware and listening to music in the early 1980s, they're probably aware of a few major, commercially successful synth pop acts that emerged from the United Kingdom in the very late 1970s, reaching their heights of commercial success and popularity in the earlier part of the 1980s. There's numerous groups we can name like this.
Mostly people in their cars.
That's fair to say. And obviously, we can cite a few groups such as this: Depeche Mode, the Human League, Ultravox. A lot of them associated with one-hit wonders, maybe in places like North America, but in the UK they're considered
the Buggles.
Yeah. But whereas in the UK or even in Australia, they had like a few hits to their name. And one group that sometimes gets thrown in here is a group called OMD. Well, Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark, the long-named ones. And so we refer to them as OMD for short. However, whereas the casual observation is that, OMD, they had a few hits with, Enola Gay and or Architectural Morality, but then maybe a few ones in the mid-80s when they went a bit cafe for a bit there. I'm not sure if it would be necessarily described as that, but they did go a certain safer direction after
it's like
album.
If Huey Lewis took the weakest cocaine possible.
That's not doesn't sound very fun or exciting.
Nah.
Oh, who wants to listen to that?
Huey Lewis on Australian cocaine.
Anyway, but the more we listen to OMD, there's a distinction made between the aforementioned groups, Ultravox's Depeche Mode, Human League, whereas true fans and snobs of electronic music think, those groups are just aping off of what the likes of... We ought to specify Ultravox without John Fox, because I think that's a fair distinction. They'll say, these groups are nothing on what obviously Kraftwerk were doing, what YMO were doing, what Telex were doing, even what Two Boy Army or John Fox with Ultravox were doing. And, there's groups who are just aping off of that, to reducing it to some nonsense for commercial success.
As well as like the Cosmish music as well, like the krautrock and even there's like Jean-Michel Jarre, some of the French
he
stuff.
was huge.
Stuff like that, yeah.
Oh yeah. Fun factoid perhaps. Michel Jarre, the first Western act to play in China following the revolution in 1950. Well, technically it was his opening act, which are also French, the very genius Space Art, which I will have to discuss on this program someday.
Yeah.
Look them up prematurely if you're so inclined, actually. It's very worthwhile. Anyway, but the more we look into OMD, a group that are popularly lumped in with one of these, British kind of like bandwagon acts, the more I listen to OMD, and we realise that OMD, among the snob world, are more respected. OMD are almost considered a very serious attempt to sincerely move forward with the artistry of Kraftwerk, much like an act like Telex in Belgium had, what YMO in Japan had. It's almost as if that the true British equivalent to Kraftwerk's lineage before New Order, and the year 1983 is important, obviously, was OMD. Now, in 1983, Dazzle Ships is released, the most experimental and audacious album yet from OMD, and it was not a major commercial smash, whereas New Order and the success of Power, Corruption and Lies and Blue Monday, a single associated with the album, though not on the album itself, infamously, became a direction with which electronic music would move forward in, and also remains a very stellar and powerful work. And New Order kind of take up the mantle of like a UK Kraftwerk, or like the discography to succeed, where Kraftwerk kind of leaves the critical favour in between Computer World and Electric Cafe. I really like Electric Cafe. You may have seen that video, and some of you, but nevertheless, there is that kind of a baton which one feels New Order taking up after Kraftwerk. Although briefly there, it was OMD were looking to be that group, I think. I don't know if that's just baseless, although one does see...
There's a brief tangent there, because that's interesting, you bring up New Order, and if you want to just move ahead a few years into the 2000s, like you look at, there's the post-punk revival, and then also the sort of like the dance punk revival.
Oh, yeah.
And you get people like, often accuse LCD Sound System of being the New Order or whatever. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting that like this album, Dazzle Ship, sounds a lot like so much of that like indie-tronica or various electronic, independent, dancey, but also a bit more, in the case of this album, I guess like, music concrete and orchestral and experimental, and Yeah, but in the tradition of like Radioactivity or something,
Yes.
that experimental electro krautrock.
Mm.
And it's very much like something like the Animal Collective is
Yeah.
the first thing that comes to mind, and it has been compared to. But very rarely have I ever heard people say that Animal Collective is just like a rip-off of OMD or something, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because they are a bit more than that, but this album has touches where you're just like, wow, this is 20 years ahead of its time, and where someone like LCD Sound System will always get flack for being New Order, the same thing doesn't quite apply. But then it's also interesting because some of those same tracks also sound like Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys tracks, which I think people sometimes have accused Animal Collective of sounding like the Beach Boys.
Yeah.
So there's a weird like triad of Pet Sounds, Dazzle Ships, and
Strawberry
certain
Yeah.
Animal Collective albums from the late 2000s.
Yeah. No, it's so fascinating to see Dazzle Ship see its day in the sunlight now, because if you go on Wikipedia, you'll find out that this album had a history of, in the 80s it was considered a failure. By the 2000s even, it was considered a noble failure. By the late 2010s, 2020s, even the band themselves used to disown it, now considering it the best thing they've ever done. And everyone's saying, wait a minute, popular music and acts that we acclaim now caught up to Dazzle Ships. When Dazzle Ships came out, there was little to compare it to, and so people didn't really know what to make of it. Listening to it again by the time of the late 2010s, and popular acclaimed acts like Animal Collective make music that sounds like Dazzle Ships. It almost seems as though Animal Collective were embodying a kind of modern, or the natural progression from certain 90s electronic sounds, modern EDM stylings, and kind of hooray sort of music. Hooray, this is, I think, mixed with a kind of certain idealism from the 1960s. It's almost as though Dazzle Ships was, it stepped too far, and it just landed somewhere where, I guess audiences and critics wanted a more gradual transformation through electronic applications in pop music. Whereas it's interesting, where something like, I feel like Kraftwerk are attempting to predict the future in Electric Cafe, and it didn't really pan out that way, especially with the bassless sort of gimmick they had going there. That really, really didn't pan out, unfortunately, for better or for worse, I don't know. For better, no, probably. But it's interesting how that with the Dazzle Ships experiment, they went too far in a direction which even something like Kraftwerk's Computer World saw its descendants kind of arising in the IDM world of the 1990s. Dazzle Ship's descendants didn't rear their heads until 2007, 2009. It's a fascinating world.
Yeah, that's true. I wonder why that is.
Well, you were going to say something, sorry?
Yeah. So I was just going to say, it's strange. This album has so much interesting like trivia involved with it. Like, I don't know what it is. It's fascinating. And like you mentioned, it's been rediscovered. And there's just so much to it. It's crazy. Like, for example, I found out what Dazzle imagery actually is. It's this weird, like, World War One ship camouflage. Did you know about this? They would use it to screw up the logistics of other battleships, so they wouldn't be able to tell the correct distance and, like, heading of the ship. It was, like, meant to make it look like an optical illusion on the ocean. Yeah, it's kind of cool. You see the old pictures of Dazzle ships, and you're like, holy hell. They kind of look like the album cover a little bit, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. And yeah, like you mentioned, in the late 2000s, like, people often cite, what's that album called? 808s and Heartbreak by Kanye West as like a ahead of the curve hip-hop album or whatever. Sort of influenced the generation that's sort of just started coming up through hip-hop around, I don't know, about 5 years ago or so.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that his like mate or whatever, Kid Cudi, he sampled a track off this album in like 2008 or something. I think it was the same year as 808s.
Yeah.
I think Kanye was influenced by Kid Cudi to make that album.
Right.
So there's a weird connection to it there as well. Like, this album has a lot of sonic connections to everything really is strange.
Huh. I'll be. Yeah, like the thing with with an experiment such as this one in Dazzle ships, you almost get the idea that, yeah, like OMD were. It feels like a conscious attempt at something art rock and a bit. It might have been a bit too 70s and album oriented for the 1980s world, because I feel like it's there are tracks on here which are kind of segue tracks which, you know, indicate that it's meant to be listened to as this entire piece. And when we listen to Organization and Architecture and Morality, there's a certain every track's a kind of, you know, potential for radio or club play, and I don't know if we necessarily get the same sort of intent with the Dazzle ship sequencing, and it's not as though groups could do this and it was necessarily considered a bad thing. I think of how like Simple Minds around this time, even if New Gold Dream, there is a couple of tracks on there, like there's an instrumental right in the middle of it, which makes you think that there is a certain art rock sort of, you know, oh, listen to the LP as a sort of novel experience pathos going on, which maybe OMD were thinking that too with earlier albums, although there is a sense that, like with the Pleasure Principle or Metamatic, like each track on that was a potential for a like a, I don't know, like the studio with the record executive, the record company person to say, okay, this is what the one you release as a single. This is an anachronistic term in the context of the early 1980s, but they're thoroughly poptimists. They believe, they're UK acts who believe in the charts, and with OMD, it's like, I'm not sure what was released as singles on here even. Do you know?
Yeah, Genetic Engineering, and Telegraph.
And do you know if the record company were kind of horrified when they realized that they had to release singles from this album?
Yeah, I assume they were. See, there's another interesting part of the trivia, actually. They signed to Virgin for this album.
Yeah.
They were on some like indie label called Din Disc, but they didn't want their fans to think they sold out, so they made up a fake record label called Telegraph Records and put the album out. Virgin put it out, but with the fake label.
Oh, man.
Yeah, and I'm sure they weren't too happy. I think there was some like NME review of Genetic Engineering calling it just like kid shit or something.
Yeah. Okay.
But I mean, they still played it on Top of the Pops.
Hmm. Yeah, do you want to talk about that performance for a moment?
That's a different one. That's
Old Grey Whistle Test. No, that's that can't.
Yeah, it was. I think it was in England. It was either in England or France. I think it was an English one. Maybe the Old Grey Whistle Test. What's that song? ABC, Auto Industry. Yeah, that's a good one. There's this weird, like, I don't even know, like, abstract data-esque, like, performance of that song, which is like a sound collage, sort of like sample, experimental, industrial pop number. You know, I guess that's what you'd call it, industrial pop, an unfounded genre.
I almost feel like that video performance, from what I saw of it, at least briefly, of OMD performing that song on television, it makes you think the visual application of everything in the song makes you think that they just threw every little idea they had. They were like, let's do that, let's do that, let's do that. And it's like the first thing they thought of. It turns out pretty well, I think. It's just like, it's aggressively creative without shame and without kind of consideration of, like, it can come across as very egotistical and very believing in oneself, but there's not much like that with that audacity, considering, like, you had to be a group with an established name and a success, and off your most successful album, as they had been with Architecture and Morality, to even think that you can get away with doing something like that on television.
Well, that's a good example of what it is as well. It's like they have a great way of juxtaposing things, like that name, Architecture and Morality, right?
Yeah.
And like you said, they're doing all this random stuff that it seems like it's straight off the top of their head, but it was probably pretty well thought out, and that's that juxtaposition where they're they're doing stuff that seems to be like spontaneous, but there's a deliberate measure of like English romanticism to it. Like, for example, the song references things like, you know, essentially industrial development, founding thing of England, and then it's comparing it to like Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah.
Mary Shelley reference.
Yeah.
So just sort of, I don't know, that's a sort of one of the formulas of OMD, I guess, juxtaposing sort of simple and complex things together, you know. I guess like architecture and morality. And you meant to like wonder which one's a simple one and which one's a complex one.
yeah, hey. No, they're a fascinating group, and
I think they like deliberately have a lot going on conceptually.
And I think it comes across like this was sort of abandoned after Dazzle ships, and the group themselves weren't fond of the album until some decades later. Yeah,
because I was the heaviest with the concept. And yeah, like you said, straight after that, they kind of just... Oh, Junk Culture, the next album's got one foot still in that. Like, I think there's a song on it called, like, Locomotive, and one called, like, Tesla or something. So they still got one foot in their other old formula, which is that same thing, really. Like, you know, you write a song about a piece of technology from, like, the early 20th century, or maybe, like, you know, the late 19th century, and it has some sort of metaphorical significance through its juxtaposition to whatever the song or emotion is. It's an interesting shtick.
I can't help but think of the megaphone crooning thing right now. But,
but then after that, when you get like Crush, and I'm not as familiar with the albums after that, but yeah, they go Huey Lewis, unfortunately. Still better than Huey Lewis, but...
Like, yeah, we have a group which... seem to rise above a lot of the kind of the what we might call the stock of UK synth pop in the early 80s. It's I think about especially from say an American or something like a Rolling Stone magazine perspective, all of these groups are the same, and you could just press a single button and have a number one hit single. But these groups have to say to that, like, they wish that was the case.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily the case. I mean, audiences decided that it wasn't the case after, like, 1984 or whatever. So clearly it wasn't a matter of just being able to, you know, press a few buttons on a synthesizer and make a hit single. Because, I mean, I think most fans of the synthesizer would agree the best examples of the genre were not what was topping the charts from 80 to 84 necessarily. I mean, I don't think anyone considers the stock 8 Waterman, Howe, you know, Rick Astley, kind of, you know, Bananarama stuff of the late 80s to be wholly indicative of the peaks of synth pop. And even though we all like Gary Newman's The Pleasure Principle, that's hardly, you know, the zenith of what that world is capable of, I think. People think of YMO, people think of John Fox, something like Simple Minds' Empire and Dance. Even some of the tracks by the Pet Shop Boys, I don't know if you call that quite synth pop, we're a bit later in the timeline, but, you know, extremely impressive and well arranged in the way that those you know, those Nile Rodgers Chic tracks, like how kind of refined they were compared to the ABBA and the Bee Gees and the kind of typical Michael Jackson stuff. So that was pretty good, to be fair, like Quincy Jones, but like compared to a lot of the disco out there, it was, you know, made it sound like slop by comparison. I feel that way about OMD and a lot of the synth pop acts surrounding it.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting as well, though, because there's still a sort of garage quality to the early OMD albums. I guess just because they're so early into British synth pop, it hasn't quite become that mechanized thing that, like you distinguished Pet Shop Boys later on. They really stand out in the, 1985 onwards, because by that point, those producers you mentioned, that whole 80s synth generic sound had taken over.
Yeah, it was no longer the domain of say a dozen artists. It was just their thing. It was just the norm.
Yeah, exactly. Now you just got every hack doing their little synth song or whatever.
Yeah, I think every pop artist for a while they just became a kind of a synth pop act,
Yeah.
more or less, by that point, and so the term was kind of meaningless. And also the synthesizers become more submerged in the mix. Think about the difference between Michael Jackson on Thriller versus Bad, and how there's that kind of post-disco sound on Bad versus the very there's no Trevor horn. You can almost hear like the Trevor horn kind of pulled out of, and the disco kind of pulled out of Bad, you know what I mean? Whereas
it's a bit more rhythmic.
Yeah, whereas even Grace Jones in 1985, the Trevor horns all over that. Even,
Sure, yeah.
Even by then. But hey, Trevor Horn wasn't all over Dazzle ships, and I don't dislike the guy, but probably all the better for it in this case.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think... Oh man, imagine if Dazzle ships was full of those, like, what do they call it? The orchestral hit. Its version of the orchestral hit is way better. Man, like, the title track of this album, they were really pushing the electronic experiments. Like, you just sit down and some beeps, and then all of a sudden it's like a submarine with, like, holding a giant bass guitar whacks you across the head. It just comes out of nowhere. Yeah, it's a really good album.
I think one of the major things to observe about Dazzle ships is there were things which electronic music had been capable of. There was the mostly artistic application of electronic music from its kind of trying to experiment and create sonic landscapes in the days of, say, Tom Disselveld, Kid Balton, Perry and Kingsley. They moved toward, and this is more in the late 50s, and then obviously Perry and Kingsley are famous for, one of them's famous for the initial Popcorn track in the later 60s, which became a pop hit. But nevertheless, Morton Subotnick and with the Silver Apples and the earliest works by Tangerine Dream, electronic music was considered as kind of out there, countercultural, almost proto or outright new age phenomenon. And when there was becoming sort of a adjacent to disco kind of proto EDM sensation in the early 80s, partly OMD was writing of that, but then with Dazzle ships they kind of turned around and wanted to compete with their buddies, or the people that wanted to be their buddies in Kraftwerk and YMO. And I think YMO's an important influence here, because YMO had the unique, and maybe a group like Telex as well, they had the unique status of being groups which were kind of aggressively artistically adventurous, whilst also being chart toppers. I mean, maybe Telex has kind of dwindled a little bit, and it would have been kind of exclusively in Western Europe for the most part. But YMO, I don't know for sure. I'm under the impression they were superstars in Japan. Maybe I know when they split, all three of them had successful solo careers, but
I'm not sure what the situation is. I assume they were popular. I mean, I've seen them tour America in the late 70s and early 80s, and they would draw big concert crowds.
The only reason I speculate that maybe they weren't so big toward the very end is because I hear Naughty Boys, an album I like, but I also think this is on the safer side for them. Maybe that's just what they felt like doing at the time. I mean, it happens. But it does make one wonder if they were thinking like, okay, last one, which was X Times Infinity, whatever that's called, didn't sell as well, and that's a bit challenging for the time.
Sure, yeah.
Maybe even for the Japanese audiences, who were probably 5 years ahead of the rest of the world, possibly. But
yeah. Plus, it could be like Love Beach or something. You rein it in. You just want to get the shit done to.
For a contract.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You'd have to look into the situation behind that album. Maybe they just weren't too invested in it.
But fortunately, I mean, OMD were invested in Dazzle ships, and it ended up in being a kind of sort of commercial ruination. But 30 years on, the guys McCluskey and co seem to think it's their best album. And I might be an organization guy at the end of the day, but this is my second choice. I'll say that.
Yeah, no, this has got to be number one for me. I think it's interesting how they're mostly influenced by Kraftwerk, and their trajectory up to this album is like mirrored. It's the same as it's mirrored to Kraftwerk, where they start out very experimental and refine that into a pop sound, And OMD, if you listen to their first album through to this one, it sort of reflects that backwards, you know. It starts out quite poppy and ends up with this. Whatever this is, I guess like Radioactivity.
Yeah. I mean, it's often, you have make this trajectory from being more experimental to more commercial, or you know, in the kind of Beatles example, more, which is the kind of the prototype archetype for this. You start out as safe as possible, and then you wind up with the opportunity to be the most experimental act, because you have the opportunity to be the resources to be of the decade. And yeah, maybe OMD are, in fact, as you once mentioned them as the English Beatles.
I'm glad you brought that up, yeah.
Genesis thought they were the Beatles in the 80s, but OMD were the real Beatles.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, definitely. I didn't think about that, but the Beatles have the same trajectory as OMD, but not quite the length or as many out. Oh, Classic Run is probably pretty comparable, actually, in my mind. Off the top of my head. Come at me, anybody who disagrees. Beatles fans. Anyway, I do like the Beatles a lot. Come at me. Yeah, anyway, yeah, it's so funny. You watch all those like Genesis music videos from the 80s, and they really, and there's like an EP cover where they're all jumping in the air.
Oh yeah,
they really wanted to be the Beatles of the 80s, but they just weren't. It was OMD.
Yeah.
Until they became Wings.
I've noticed here the battery on this computer isn't as strong as it used to be. We're at 6%, and we're at 26 minutes on this review, so I might end
26 minutes, nice.
And we will continue watching. It's
probably about half the album.
Yeah, actually, that's true. Yeah, and anyway, whilst we appreciate England's contributions to popular music, we are vaguely hoping that they lose in this Ashes series, which is currently on lunch break and it shall return very shortly. And so we assume that you may be watching that as well, but probably not. Thanks again, my good and dear friends. Oh, anything else you want to say? Actually,
as long as Stephen Fry's watching the cricket, they're going to lose.
That's actually a potential curse out of so-called the 2006 series. That was it
2005?
Five, excuse me. That was the go. Well, anyway, thanks again, my good and dear friends.
Ciao.